Well, it's not often you get an introduction like that. These don't bend, huh? This is kind of weird. Thanks, man. That's really sweet. It's true that we go back years and years, and in fact, for those of you who have this book, you can find his name at the very beginning because I dedicated it to him. He's a great friend, and he's a very forgiving friend. You have to be forgiving, as my wife will attest, because I can be a real asshole sometimes. He lived with me we lived together for 4 years, so over the course of 4 years, a lot gets done and said. There was a gentleman I just ran into who said that he hoped that I would talk more than read. I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint him. I'm going to read for about 20 minutes. And you know, if it's too long for you, feel free to nod off. Then after the reading, I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Betsy Convoy was my head hygienist and a devout Roman Catholic. If ever I was tempted to become a Christian, which I never was, but if I was, I thought I would do well to become a Roman Catholic like Mrs. Convoy. She attended Mass at St. Joan of Arc Church in Jackson Heights, where she expressed her faith with hand gestures, genuflections, recitations, liturgies, donations, confessions, lit candles, saints' days, and several different call and responses. Catholics speak, like baseball players, in the coded language of gesture. Sure, the Roman Catholic Church is an abomination to man and a disgrace to God, but it comes with a highly structured Mass, several sacred pilgrimages, the oldest songs, the most impressive architecture, and a whole bunch of things to do whenever you enter the church. Taken all together, they make you one with your brother. Say I'd come in from outside and go straight to the sink to wash my hands. It didn't matter which sink, Mrs. Convoy would find me. She'd sniff at me like a bloodhound, and then she'd say, "What exactly have you been doing?" I'd tell her, and she'd say, "Why do you feel the need to lie to me?" I'd tell her, and she'd say, "Scrutiny does not kill people. Smoking kills people. What kind of example do you think you're setting for your patients by sneaking off to smoke cigarettes?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "They do not need a reminder of the futility of it all from their dental professional. When did you take up smoking again?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, then why did you tell everyone that you had quit?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "I do not see how the occasional show of concern is utterly strangulating. I would like to see you live up to your potential, that is all. Don't you wish you had more self-control?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "Of course I will not join you. What are you doing? Do not light that cigarette." I'd put the cigarettes away with an offhand remark. She'd say, "How am I a trial? I am not the trial here. The trial is between you and your addictions. Do you want to ruin your lungs and die a young man?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "You are not already in hell. Shall I tell you what hell will be like?" I'd answer. She'd say, "Yes, as a matter of fact, any conversation can turn into a discussion on the salvation of the soul. It's a pity more don't. What are you doing at that window?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "We are on the first floor. You would hardly manage to sprain an ankle." I'd come out of the bathroom, and she'd be standing right there. "I've been looking all over for you," she'd say. "Where have you been?" I'd tell her the obvious. She'd say, "Why must you call the bathroom the Thunderbox?" I'd tell her, adding a few details, and she'd grow very severe. She'd say, "Please do not refer to what you do in the bathroom as making the Pope's fountain. I know the Pope is just a joke to you. I know the Catholic Church is nothing but a wedding stone for your wit. But I happen to hold the Church in the highest regard, and though you can understand that, if you had any respect for me, you would mind what you say about the Pope." I'd answer with an apology, but she'd ignore me. "Sometimes I honestly wonder whether you care about anyone's feelings but your own." And she'd walk away. I'd never learn why she was standing outside the Thunderbox unless it was to bring grief to us both. Later, after letting it fester, she'd say, "Well, tell me, Do you care about anyone else's feelings? Do you have any respect for me at all? Of course I had respect for her. Let's say the day's scheduling worked out as planned and we had 5 cleanings to perform all at once. To minimize wait times and to maximize my turnaround, I would normally require 3, if not 4, dedicated hygienists. But I had Betsy Convoy. Betsy Convoy, with the help of 1 or 2 rotating temps, could manage all 5 chairs. She could x-ray, chart, scale, and polish, tutor each patient in preventive treatment, leave detailed notes for my follow-up exams, and still manage to supervise the staff and oversee the scheduling. Most dentists won't believe that, but then most dentists have never had a truly great hygienist like Mrs. Convoy. Well, she'd say, why aren't you answering me? But most days I would have cheerfully stood by and watched her die. Better her dead, I thought, than being around. I would never have found anyone to replace her, but Betsy Convoy being around, there was the true Calvary. Poor Betsy. She was responsible for our efficiency, our professionalism, and a good portion of our monthly billing. Her internalization of Catholicism and its institutional disappointments suited a dental office perfectly, where guilt was often our last resort for motivating the masses. Handing out a toothbrush to a charity patient, she'd tell that person, be faithful in small things. Who does that? But then, out of nowhere, I'd imagine her getting fucked doggy style by a muscular African on one of the dental chairs. Of course I respect you, Betsy. We couldn't go on without you. Later at the bar, I'd be the last one to leave. She'd be second to last. She'd say, don't you think you've had enough? I'd tell her. She'd say, but how are you going to get home? I'd tell her. She'd say, Connie's gone, dear. She left 2 hours ago. Come on, let's get you home. She'd put me in a cab. She'd say, can you handle it from here? And then I don't know what. We'd take a one-off trip somewhere far-flung. I'd fight and say no fucking way, but somehow she'd get me on that plane. We once flew from JFK to New Delhi, and from New Delhi to Biju Patnaik, and then took a train 50 kilometers inland, where we walked through the cesspool streets in sweltering heat as limbless beggars crushed behind us, issuing soft exhortations. The clinic was little more than 2 armchairs under a luncheon umbrella. We were stationed right next to the cleft palate folks. It was enough just to see them at work. I'd say to her, I can't believe I let you drag me to this goddamn country. She'd tell me not to take the Lord's name in vain. I'd say, might not be the best time to demand a show of respect for the Lord. How much respect did the good Lord show these kids? There was pulp necrosis, tongue lesions, Gorder-like presentations on account of the abscesses. I could go on. I will go on. Stained teeth, fractured teeth, necrotic teeth, teeth growing one behind the other, growing sideways, open sores, gingival discharge, ulcers, dry sockets, trench mouth, incurable caries, and the malnutrition that follows from the impossibility of eating. Those tender infant mouths never stood a chance. A sane person doesn't stick around in the hopes of making a dent. A sane person takes the next plane home. I stayed for tax reasons. That's it. A solid write-off. And I liked the roasted lamb. You can't find lamb like that even in Manhattan. Mrs. Convoy said we were there to do God's work. I'm here for the lamb, I told her. As for God's work, I said, seems like we're undoing it. She disagreed. This was the reason we had been put on earth. Pessimism, skepticism, complaint, and outrage, I said to her. That's why we were put on earth. Unless you were born out here, then it's pretty clear that your only purpose was to suffer. A finished biography appealed to Mrs. Convoy more than a work in progress. All of the important men in her life were dead, Christ the Savior, Pope John Paul II, and Dr. Bertram Convoy, himself a dentist before a fatal stroke. Betsy was only 60, but had been widowed 19 years. I always considered her alone, if not chronically lonely, but she was never alone. She was in the tripart company of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, as well as the irreproachable presence of the Virgin Mother, in fellowship with saints and martyrs, one in spirit with the Pope in Rome, deferential to her bishop, confessional to her priest, and friend and comfort to all fellow members of her parish. If the Catholic Church had come under assault for its many sins, inside the church the bonds had never been stronger, and Betsy Convoy needed no one's sympathy for widowhood, solitude, or the appearances of a barren life. I was convinced that she would never die, but if she did, and though her funeral amount to a very modest affair, she was bound for happy reunions in a better world, in the brotherhood of a loving multitude, while her tombstone was still fresh with wreaths of everlastings. She'd order a book. It was called Stop the Scheduling Madness, or The Way of the Zero Balance Office, or The $1 Million Dentist. This last was written by someone named Barry Hallow. He wasn't even a dentist. He was a consultant. His proven methods can change your practice, your financial health, and even your life expectancy. Most of all, he writes, he can help you achieve happiness. Hey, who doesn't want that? Anything less than complete happiness is for complete losers, really depressed people, people losing their eyesight, and child actors who turn out to be weird looking. It wasn't going to happen here, not with Barry Hallow. We schedule inefficiently, treat insufficiently, and bill ineffectively, Mrs. Convoy concluded, in the words of Barry Hallow. I took exception to the claim that we treated insufficiently. We do not spend enough time, she countered, instructing patients on preventive treatment, which in the long run would make them healthier. Preventive treatment doesn't pay the bills, I said. We're running a practice here, not a master class. I know we're not running, and besides, I said, we do in fact spend a hell of a lot of time on preventive treatment relative to other practices. But remember who you're talking about here, Betsy. Human beings, lazy, short-sighted knockbacks who you try rousing to brush after 4 glasses of Merlot on a Wednesday night. Ain't gonna happen, no matter how much we preach preventive measures every time they deign to remember an appointment and drag themselves in here like children sent to pick up their toys. Just ain't gonna happen. You have a low opinion of humanity, she'd say. And ignoring her, I'd say, and it's not like we're asking much. The hands take care of themselves, the feet more or less take care of themselves, the nostrils require a little attention from time to time, as does the sphincter, that's about it. A little oral upkeep ain't a lot to ask in exchange for the good times. The bonobos spend their days picking themselves free of ticks and lice. They could be the bonobos. Oh, for heaven's sakes, you've gone off the rails again. Just listen to me for 1 second, will you? Barry Hallow's methods are proven, and if you just follow the 12 steps he lays out, then he guarantees, I have it written down here somewhere, take the time, the teeth will shine, and the patient will sign on the dotted line. Swell little posy, I said. That clown's not even a dentist. I would like permission to put some of his methods into practice. Will it require any more work from any of us, I said. It's likely to require a little bit more work from some of us, yes. Are any of them me? It's likely, she said. No chance, I said. I kept a deliberately low profile online. No website, no Facebook page. But I'd Google myself, and what came up every time were the same 3 reviews. The one I wrote, the one I nagged Connie into writing, and the one Anonymous wrote. Don't think I didn't know who Anonymous was. I'd given the guy every opportunity to pay me. Finally, I engaged a collection agency. I don't like collection agents any more than you do. Their strategy is to treat you overtly and in more subtle ways like a fucking loser until you're so demoralized by their condescension and exhausted by their hectoring that you strike a bargain so that in a couple of years you won't be declined at the Macy's again. I get it. But listen, this guy was into me for $8,000. I did the work. I made it possible. Listen, I made it possible for this jerk to resume eating. I was owed cost at the very least. So what does he do? He gets on a payment schedule of $20 a month and then promptly broadcasts his resentment that someone demanded he act honorably by posting a review calling my work shoddy and overpriced. And on top of that, he says I have cave dwellers. I don't have cave dwellers. I make it a point to inspect my nostrils in the mirror before I go and hover over a patient. It's common courtesy, but now the world thinks I have cave dwellers. If somebody's doing a little research on the internet for a new dentist, are they likely to choose the guy who might gouge them for lousy work while showering them with his cave dwellers? No. But there is no countering, no appeal, no entity to whom I can plead my case to have the post removed. So I'd Google myself every month or so, and when the review from Anonymous came up, as it did without fail every time, I'd curse out loud and feel the victim of an injustice, and Mrs. Convoy would say, "Stop Googling yourself." She'd say, "What do you have against other people?" And I'd say, I'd be sitting at the front desk in one of the swivel chairs at the front desk, doing paperwork or something, and I'd look up from the paperwork and I'd say, "What do I have against other people? I have nothing against other people." And she'd say, "You alienate yourself from society." And I'd say, I'd turn physically in the chair to look at her, and I'd say, "Who alienates himself from society?" "You don't have a website," she'd say, "and you refuse to create a Facebook page. You have no online presence." Barry Hallow says, "And for this I'm being accused of alienating myself from society because I don't have a Facebook page?" All I'm trying to say is that Barry Hallow encourages everyone to have an online presence. An online presence guarantees more business. It's proven. That's all I'm trying to say. "No, that's not all you're trying to say, Betsy," I'd say. "That's not at all you're trying to say. If it was, you wouldn't have accused me of alienating myself from society." "You have misunderstood my intentions," she'd say. "I think you have willfully misunderstood me." "I don't have anything against other people, Betsy. Do I understand other people? No, most people I don't understand. What they do mystifies me. They're out there right now, playing in the fields, boating, whatever. Good for them. You know what, Betsy? I'd love to boat with them. Yeah, let's boat. Let's eat shrimp together." "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," she'd say. "How do we start talking about eating shrimp? I'll never forgive myself for bringing this up." "No, don't walk away, Betsy. Let's hash this out. Do you think I can just willy-nilly without a care in the world go out there and go boating?" "Who said anything about going boating?" she'd say. "Think I can just toss everything aside and go tanning and rock climbing and pick apples and shop for rugs and order salad and put my change in the same place night after night and wash the sheets and listen to U2 and drink Chablis?" "What on earth are you talking about?" she'd say. "I was only trying to convince you to build a website and get on Facebook to improve our billings." "I have no idea why I can't do those things," I'd say, "but I can't. I want to do them, those ordinary night and weekend things, holiday things, vacation things." "Will you please stop stepping on my heels?" she'd say. "You know as well as anyone just how small this office is." "Don't you know," I'd say, "how much I'd love to go to a bar and watch a game? Don't you know how much I'd love a whole bunch of buds, a whole bunch of dude buds hollering yo at me when I come through the door? Yo and mofo and beer me and hey bro and all of that. All of my best dude buds on bar stools drinking beer, watching the game with me." "I'm going inside to tend to a patient now," she'd say. "I'm afraid we will have to continue this conversation another time." "I would really like that, Betsy, to cheer and jeer and hoot and root alongside a band of brothers. I would love that. But do you have any idea how much attention you have to pay to a Red Sox game? Even a regular season Red Sox game?" "I have decided that I'm going to stand here and listen to you until you are quite finished," she'd say, "because I feel I have touched a nerve. But just because I choose not to have dude buds, don't think I don't worry about what I'm missing out on. Don't think I'm not haunted knowing what I might be missing out on, the things that I much prefer not to be missing out on. I am haunted, Betsy. You think I alienate myself from society? Of course I alienate myself from society. It's the only way I know of not being constantly reminded of all the ways I'm alienated from society. That doesn't mean I have anything against other people. Envy them? Of course. Marvel at them? Constantly. Secretly study them? Every day. I just don't get any closer to understanding them. And liking something you don't understand, estranged from it without reason, longing to commune with it, who'd ask for it, Betsy? I ask you, who would ask for it? "Are you quite finished now?" she'd say. "This is turning out to be one of the longest ordeals of my life. But do you want to know what I don't understand even more that I don't understand the boating and the tanning? Reading about the boating and the tanning online. I was already at one remove before the internet came along. I need another remove. Now I have to spend the time I'm not doing the thing they're doing, reading about them doing it, streaming all of the clips of them doing it, commenting on how lucky they are to be doing all of those things, liking and digging and bookmarking and posting and tweeting all of those things, and feeling more disconnected than ever. Where does the idea of greater connection come from? I've never in my life felt more disconnected. It's like how the rich get richer, the connected get more connected, while the disconnected just get more disconnected. No thanks, man, I can't do it. Their world was a sufficient trial, Betsy, before Facebook." "I take back my suggestion that you have something against other people," she'd say, "and I'll never suggest a website or a Facebook page ever again." I was a dentist, not a website. I was a muddle, not a brand. I was a man, not a profile. They wanted to contain my life with a summary of its purchases and preferences, prescription medications, and predictable behaviors. That was not a man. That was an animal in a cage. She'd say, "When was the last time you attended church?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "Never is not an option. Everyone has been to church at least once. Try being honest." I'd tell her. She'd say, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, no one worships a little blue leprechaun. First of all, leprechauns are not blue. Second of all, you know as well as anyone that leprechauns did not make heaven and earth. I see no reason to believe in leprechauns and every reason to believe in God. I see God in the sky, and I see God on the street. Can you really sit there and suggest that you do not feel God's hand at work in the world?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "One cannot feel the work of the Big Bang. Why must you always bring up the Big Bang when we're trying to have a discussion about God?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "But you can't be good on account of the Big Bang. You can only be good on account of God. Don't you want to be good?" I'd tell her. She'd say, "Metaphysical blackmail, my patootie. I want you to answer me. Do you think you're good?" I'd say, "Yes, I thought I was good." And then she'd think about it for a minute, and she'd say, her voice would drop, and she'd put her hand on my arm, and she'd say, "But are you well?" She'd say, "Are you well?" Thank you. Okay, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Hey, that was so fast. Wow. Usually we sort of stare at each other awkwardly for, a minute or so. Yeah. Well, when I start something, I usually like to pair it with a profession, because these characters will become instantly more honest that way. They're people in the world as opposed to sort of representative people that. And I'm perfectly happy to read a book that is about a truck driver or a neurologist and never in those pages encounter a truck or a neuron. That's fine with me. But when I'm writing, it kind of instantly makes them more real. And then their profession tends to, inform the narrative and the action to some extent. So I knew that I wanted to have patients come in, and then that became a little bit more thematic in that he's always dealing with rot and decay, and he's a pretty down, he's a downer dude for a good portion of the book. So I needed a reason for that, and in the States, in any event, there's the dentistry is the profession with the highest rate of suicide. So it's a pretty downer profession apparently. So there were a lot of different reasons, but mainly it was kind of an exigent reason. I wanted him to do stuff. I feel like having characters do stuff and having that stuff being informed by his or her profession just generates a lot of content for me.
Did you do research did you sit in an office? Did you talk to dentists? How did you?
I talked to one dentist who was decidedly unhelpful because he was sort of on his way out. And all I kept talking about was going golfing and being retired. So he didn't exactly help a lot. I watched some YouTube clips and I read some books, and the YouTube will get you close to the visceral stuff. So that really gave me an idea of what they deal with on a daily basis. And then the books were really helpful because some dentists there are dentists that seem really shallow, or at least guys that are writing books about dentists seem sometimes really shallow, like they're just about the money. Here's how you can maximize your bottom line. And then there were others who were really take into great consideration why does they tend to treat patients, basically, because they live for their whole lives with these wrecks of, their mouths are just wrecks, and it really affects their entire lives, their confidence, their professional life, their love life. And so I got a real sense of the considerable sympathy for patients through those books. That was helpful. Well, I can't really say that I know a whole heck of a lot about the Catholic Church. I have him. this fella is not high on the Catholic Church, except he sort of isn't insofar as he really likes these communities that he sees from the outside. So knowing that I was filtering a lot of Catholicism through him, when you're writing a novel, you kind of wing it, and you don't have to know a whole heck of a lot. So I'm certainly no expert on the Catholic Church, and this is always important to say, some of the opinions espoused in the commentary are not necessarily the studio's. So, I learned a bit by reading, but I really don't know that I know a lot. I know very intimately how he feels, but I don't know a lot about it per se. A website. I don't have a Facebook page. I have a website because it apparently sells books, but I don't have a Facebook page.
Do you feel the same way the author does about the intrusions into your privacy on social media?
Well, if I really cared, I think I would actually have a Facebook page. Because if you eschew the maintenance of your identity online to those with stronger opinions than you, those opinions are the ones that get sort of more and more calcified. So if I really cared, I would be out there kind of grooming my brand and checking my Wikipedia page and adding every bit of impressive detail. I don't care. So I, don't go on. I did not know how The Unnamed was going to end. I was figuring out how to make the book end, because I sort of knew the very end, but I didn't really know. To some extent, the book is a record, as all of my books are records to some extent of me as a man and me as a thinker and me as a human being, like trying to figure stuff out, how I think about certain things, how I feel about certain things, what's important, what I find to be of value in the world. And this was definitely that, because he's essentially disease riddled until he dies, and that's the trajectory, and that was really important for me. I knew that from the very beginning. But what was it that he valued? What did he care for? And I found that in the book, and I answered those questions actually for me as a person in surprising ways that actually transcended the book itself. So I learned all that stuff during the composition.
So then is this just so then is this third one then sort of a continuation in some sense to the first two?
No, once I'm done, I'm done. I think that I'm also, though, bringing certain things to bear, which is to say I'm still interested in figuring out how I feel about certain things. At the very beginning of this book, you have a person who's, I think, in despair. He's not happy with himself. He doesn't know how to engage. He doesn't know what meaningful connection means. He kind of blunders his way through a series of relationships. To some extent, that I suppose that's chronicling my own blundering, but it's also kind of thinking in different ways that I never would have had as a human being. It's thinking, I suppose, as an artist, as a person who lives in his imagination. What's possible? What's possible for a human being? How do I want this specific story to resolve? A lot of those things just come out of, a curiosity and a desire to shape things and make them more artful than I find them in real life. Yeah, there's a lot of riffs in there. I think everything I just read was basically a riff, because it doesn't contribute really to the, you get character development and things like that, but the plot or, the story of the thing is not really touched on. And definitely I can be too long in the tooth, but I think the thing that comes down to is, to what extent do I want to allow myself almost a perverse sense of violation of your patience, your indulgence, and then curb it right at that moment where I really need to give you more form and make you feel like you're in the hands of somebody, because I have a lot to say, but I also want what I have to say to be shaped. I don't want to be formless. I think shape and form and narrative are the artful reasons that we go to novels. I think there's as much wisdom to be found as novels as in nonfiction, and there's as much form to be found in nonfiction as there is in the novel. But what's unique about encountering the novel is that there's an extraordinary amount of wisdom that's been really shaped over the course of time. I mean, it's, you know, and so, to, you know, basically to answer your question, it's the constant battle between those two things, asking me to kind of like go off on my own and do this thing that may seem actually unartful to you, or like riff or tangential or not crucial to the, but in fact I think that all of that stuff is what makes the novel, and not some piece of nonfiction. It's the fun, it's the entertainment of it. So yeah, I'm really, that's a really interesting tension throughout all of my work. How much can I get loose, and then how much do I pull back to shape and to form? Primarily because I think shape and form are so vital to the novel. I write from about 9 to 5, you know. I wake up and try to get the cobwebs out of my head, and then go to work, and then have a break for lunch, and then work till, you know, maybe 4 or something like that. And then I go for a run and hang out.
And on a good day, how many pages will come out of that? I mean, just raw pages.
5, maybe. 5 or 6. But, you know, they're not I mean, at the end of the year, then I'd have, what would I have? I'd have like 1,500-page novel, you know, and I'd be like, publishing one a year at 1,500 pages would be great. But it doesn't, yeah, it should give you an indication of how few keepers there really are on a day-to-day basis. There are, yeah, sadly, very few. Well, you know, Grant told us the story earlier of I didn't know about Joyce. That's funny. But, you know, I didn't know about Philip Roth before I encountered Grant. Grant, you were reading, what were you reading at that time? Really? Yeah. Wow. Oh, because he had just that's 91 or something like that, yeah. So, you know, like that was new to me, and Roth was, at that time, Roth was, interestingly, I think Roth was like very disparaged. He was not nearly the saint of American fiction that he is now, because he was writing these very indulgent kind of, or what was perceived to be indulgent metafictional narratives. But in any event, Grant turned me on to Roth. At that time I was reading Nabokov, and I guess, you know, predictably the people that you would read. But in 1992, there was also a school of American writers that nobody reads anymore, like the metafictionalists, like, you know, William Gass and William Gaddis and John Hawkes. John Hawkes was huge to me, you know, like he was a really important writer. But boy, you ask somebody these days, like somebody 10 years younger than me, nobody will know who Hawkes is. Donald Barthelme was really important to me, and I mean, he's sort of read, but maybe a story here or there, but nobody like devours him like we did in college. I got when I was in college. Well, here's what I'd say to that. I mean, first, on a personal note, I think they're important. The first 20 weeks of 10 or 20 weeks of a writing school is important because it teaches you some good stuff. And then you got like 40 weeks to just bear up. But they're kind of paying you because you tend to their kids, and, you know. So you got time and money to write. But anymore, I kind of think that the argument needs to be updated, because if you talk about anyone who's published anything over the past 30 or 40 years, they've all gone to a writing school. Name the writer that you enjoy reading. Likely they've gone to, I mean, David Foster Wallace, Jonathan Franz, and Jeffrey Eugenides, Nicole Krauss, who else? I'm missing some names, but Boyle, Michael Chabon. You know, everybody went to a program. There's a book out now called MFA versus NYC, and it's by Chad Harbach. It's an essay collection, and basically he says this, like, we're all MFA students now. So if you've encountered a novel over the last 20 years that has been meaningful to you, and it doesn't seem to reek of the stale classroom, those people manage to come out of a program and make interesting fiction. So I just don't think it's anymore. It's just not. It's really not. It's not a pertinent argument. because we're all doing it. And most of them, in order to afford their lives, in order to make a living, work in an MFA program. And some of the most interesting fiction is written there. Nobody reads it, but it's extremely interesting work. And the reason that they're working there is because nobody reads them. So, you know, to some extent, it's a much more subtle argument than do you think it's a bad thing, you know? Yeah. Well, it's hard to say. When I have a real burst, right, I'm pretty much, it's all just writing, and then I refine it through revision. And then really when I revise, what I'm doing is just getting rid and then rewriting. So a lot of the work is revising to make sure it's tight and it works and the lines land correctly and the prose sounds good and the characters are being developed and so on and so forth. And that's a lot of hard revision work, but most of it is writing. I'd say, you know, 90%.
So it's not the drudgery that one might think?
No, it's drudgery. No, it's drudgery for sure. All of it's a kind of mild, low simmering drudgery. But it's also like a mild, you know, fever of sorts. It's really fun. It's a real weird mix. Well, yeah, he's a big Red Sox fan. He's an avid Sox fan. He's been one forever and ever. And then in 2004, they had the temerity to win. And so, you know, I was thinking that really it was kind of a terrible thing for a Red Sox fan to suddenly be a winner. They've been losers for 86 years. They had...
You could get shot in Boston for saying that.
Yes, yeah, I elided this answer in Boston, when I was in Boston, but I will tell you, now that we're far from there, that to me it seemed like it could be a terrible, almost like, well, what do I want now? You know, my whole life, if you're born after, when was the 28 or something, which most people were, you had been defined as a chronic loser. It was not like the Cubs, because you know, Boston had come really close on 3 or 4 different occasions. But man, if then in 2005 and in 2008 especially, they looked a lot like the Yankees. I mean, they started poaching players. So there was like a muddle of who am I if I'm a Red Sox fan? So he's a Red Sox fan who's confused about this. And I think their confusion is important because for many men in the States, and this is probably true for women too, religious feeling gets diverted to sports. So he's a deeply committed, very religious man about the Red Sox. But when they fail him, he starts to look for something a little deeper. Like that's where his community is. That's where his sense of belonging and identity resides. And so when they fail him by winning, he's sort of thrust out and made to think about what else what might be a different way of being religious. So that's how it connects. Yeah, it's a great question. To be honest, when I came into advertising, I was fresh out of school, so I was much more accustomed, really, to writing academic essays. So I turned in an academic essay for a bit of copywriting, and they're like, son, what have you done? Do you not understand that you are trying to, 1, keep people's attention, and 2, address the lowest common denominator? So it was very confusing for me to go from a place like academia where basically intelligence and long argument and truth were important, into advertising, where those things were completely, kind of disregarded. So what was great about that was like an understanding of what the content should be. I always wanted to tell true things. I didn't really want to tell the things that my superiors in advertising were telling me to do. But what I did learn was very, very crucial, and I think very important, was that you did need to actually recognize that there was an end user to this thing you were writing. In academia, there is no end user. You know, there's a bunch of people who are trying to get tenure, and they don't really care. So, I mean, these are gross generalizations, but this is sort of how I, had worked my way through it, which is to say, I started to recognize that there was a reader. And that helped me start writing just shorter sentences that actually were meant to communicate. Whereas before it was, very intelligent and that sort of thing. It just wasn't working. So it was pretty crucial, but at the same time, it was also pretty crucial to recognize the difference in the content, like what I was, and that's why I ultimately got disillusioned with advertising, if in fact I was ever illusioned with it. Well, the ideas kind of seem suited to a story or to a novel. I have these short stories that never would have sustained a novel's length. So they just sort of immediately occurred to me as such. And then the writing of them just becomes basically a kind of a hyper attention to the form. I've got to do the other things, but knowing what they are, I have to remain either constrained or, to bring it kind of back to your question, that's when I can riff more. I don't feel like I can riff in a story as much. So in fact, they have they're working an entirely different part of the brain because one has a lot more constraints than the other. And to some extent, a story is much harder because I don't feel like I have that kind of liberty. I don't have the same liberty that I do in a novel. Well, thank you guys. I will sign a book if you want me to.